For those of you who don't know me, and I do know many people in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm Glenn Knott. I'm the Vice President and Managing Director of Skillsoft Asia Pacific. Don't let the accent fool you. Yes, I am Australian, but I actually live in the United States. Flew in here with my wife on Friday last week. Spent the weekend in Melbourne, this week in Sydney, finish off the week in Melbourne and then head home. And I said to a few people this morning that this is a big week in the US. As many of you know, it's Thanksgiving week. First time my wife has sort of missed Thanksgiving, so I'm doing the right thing, buying her a turkey sandwich on Thursday. I think she'll be right, she'll get through it. But it's great to be back in Sydney, and a big warm welcome on behalf of Skillsoft to everybody here. For those of you that attended our Perspectives event in Sydney back in August, I'm just going to sort of touch on and review a couple of sort of slides just to kick the formalities off this morning. So bear with me if you've seen these slides, but I just kind of want to put into perspective what we're really here to talk about this morning, which is the findings of a study that we went through at Skillsoft. We engaged an independent third party to go out and survey our customers, and we're going to be presenting that sort of information to you this morning. But bear with me as I just sort of take you through sort of why we sort of went down that process. And as I said, for those of you who have seen these at Perspective, excuse me, but hopefully it might refresh some of your memory as well. We came across some data late last year from a report that McKinsey put together. And we were sort of looking as an organisation at Skillsoft, talking to our customers about the changing world in which we live in, but more in particular about learning and what's happening within organisations today. Anyway, we came across this report that McKinsey put together, really looking at learning and how it's transforming. And one of the things that they found as part of that study is that worldwide, and in organisations of every type, so whatever industry you represent here today, people processes are failing to keep pace with the changing business landscape. And again, sort of nothing sort of revolutionary there or outstanding. I'm sure many of you represent industry right across the board here in Sydney and are finding the same sorts of things. What kind of became a little bit alarming to us as we sort of delved deeper into this report, though, is that when we started to look at whether or not human resource functions, learning and development functions were ready for that transformation, here's again what that report revealed, is that the percentage of human capital professionals, and human capital professionals were categorised by, you know, head of HR, CLO, head of learning and development, etc. But the percentage of human capital professionals who are taking action against those priority areas, 58%, who are pursuing truly innovative approaches, just over a third, and then under a third had high confidence in their strategy or actions. So, you know, that was kind of enlightening to us as an organisation because of, you know, the conversations that we have with our customers to find that human resource professionals, L&D professionals were telling us that they're not really ready for that transformation. They're not looking at innovative approaches to what they're doing for their organisations. And again, what became alarming for us is this is the #1 issue for CEOs today. But yet we're not doing it and we're not responding as professionals. Again, taken from the same sort of information, human capital issues are the #1 area issue that CEOs are that's what's keeping them up at night. You know, how do we tackle this changing world, this changing pace that our businesses are experiencing? How do we maintain and ensure that our human resources within our organisations, you know, have the appropriate skill level, have the ability to take our organisations further into the future? Even though the data was presented by McKinsey out of the US, it did have an Asia-Pacific bent to it. We extracted some of the Asia-Pacific material out of it, and I used this data in similar presentations that I delivered in India and China recently. Unfortunately, we were unable to extract some of the ANZ, the Australia-New Zealand data, which kind of led us to why we're here again this morning, which I'll touch on before I introduce Rosie a little bit later on. But similarly in Asia Pacific, the #1 factor was human capital. So it's kind of a global trend. It just hasn't sort of been a statistic that's come out of the United States. And again, if that's the world in which we live in, if they're the challenges that we're facing, if they're the number one issues that CEOs are trying to address, what are the sort of 4 key things out of that McKinsey report came out to say, how do we address that? How do we ensure that we're capitalising on the most important asset within our organisation? And the report touched on 4 things: anticipate and plan for the future of work. So I guess the example that I use here is, if you're the number one organisation in your industry, how do you stay number one? How do you look ahead and plan to ensure that your competitive strength is maintained? How do you ensure that isn't being replicated by your competitors? And if you're number 2 or you're number 3 in your industry, how do you get to number 1? How do you plan ahead for that? The second point there, develop strategies to engage and re-energise your employees. We're going to talk a little bit about employee engagement as we go along this morning. And again, if you recall, for those of you who are at Perspectives, I think we referenced a book by Dan Pontefract called A Flat Army. He talks a lot about employee engagement, and when you have great employee engagement, the benefits that organisations can stem for that. The third point there, becoming more agile. This was a real hot topic for our customers a few years ago. I think it's still just as relevant today. Again, how do you anticipate the rapid pace of change within our organisations and our industries? And again, how do you plan for it? And then the fourth point there is secure a steady pipeline of leaders at all levels. And I know in talking with all of our customers, not just in Australia and New Zealand, but as I travel into the 14 countries that I represent in Asia Pacific and also in North America, is that this whole issue about leadership and developing leaders within our organisations is paramount for just about everybody. I quite often reference a bank down in Melbourne that I met with recently, who have put together a leadership program for the person that joins the bank on day one. Not just for their senior level managers, not just for their executives, but for every single person that is employed within the organisation. Now, admittedly, they all have different levels of leadership. Obviously, the CEO has a different focus and skill level than what the person does that joins the bank on the very first day. But still, planning for leadership is absolutely critical for most organisations. And when we pull all those 4 points together and start to focus on those and draw our attention to the number one, problem issue that our CEOs are facing, then we start to address this issue of transforming learning and moving ahead in terms of addressing those particular points. So, sort of, how does that tie into this morning and why we're here this morning? That McKinsey report, as I said, was very insightful for us. It provided us a few answers in terms of what's going on within our customers and client base. And while it did have an element of Asia-Pacific data attached to it, we wanted to find out more about what was happening in Australia and New Zealand, what was happening within your organisations and some of the issues that you're facing. But I think more importantly, how can we take that information and sort of help you and guide you, put together business plans, business cases, and sort of help you justify, more expenditure when we know that expenditure is being cut within our organisation. So we engaged an independent third party to go out and talk to our customers really about 3 particular areas. And they were about learner engagement, employee engagement, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier, learning budgets and what's happening to those, and then finally the learning's impact to our business. And it really, bottom line, is about measurement. And those were the 3 areas that we focused on when we spoke to and addressed and interviewed our customers. So what we're here today is to present you with some of those findings. And again, not just to sort of present you with data and say, well, look, this is what's happening, because I'm sure a lot of you reflect on that and think, okay, very similar to what's going on within our organisation. But again, what we want to do is to be able to give you this insight, give you this information that will help you have these conversations with people back within your organisations, talk to them about what's happening within the industry, because you're not alone. A lot of these issues, we're all facing. I would want to now hand over to Rosie Cairns. Many of you know Rosie. She heads up our sales and support function here in Australia and New Zealand, based in Sydney. Rosie's going to share with you some of the data, delve into it a little bit deeper, and again share with you how we went through the process, the sort of findings that we came up with, or the third party came up with, and hopefully you'll find the information of use and benefit. So over to you, Rosie.
All right, thank you, Glenn, and welcome everyone here this morning. I'm really glad that you could make it in your busy schedules, and you'll have to excuse me because I am going to reference some notes because I've got a lot of data to walk through with you today. But you know what, Glenn is absolutely right. There's really a lack of good, solid data points that represent the Australian-New Zealand marketplace in terms of what's going on with trends. And you know, how often do we find ourselves referencing US-based reports, and as we've just done here this morning, and as great as they all are, there's no doubt about it, and they absolutely have their place, and we love McKinsey and we love IDC, and we've got some fantastic input from and insight from those data points. But wouldn't it be nice if we actually had some references around what's going on in our own backyard and in our own territories? You know, how often are you asked to build a case for change internally, only to discover that there is a lack of information out there that relates to our specific marketplace and trends? So that's really what compelled us to take a close look and try and find out what is going on across Australia and New Zealand, and really what's the relationship then to the global trends that we're seeing. So what we hope today is to share with you some insights, and as Glenn pointed out, what we'd really love for you to do is to consider some of these insights in terms of your own programs and your own plans and your own strategies, and what you can do in light of these insights to perhaps alter or adjust your programs accordingly. So with that, let me share with you a little bit of information about the report itself. So the report takes an in-depth look at emerging trends within high-impact organisations across Australia and New Zealand. We really wanted to, as Glenn pointed out, focus on some three key areas to really help business and L&D leaders as they look to try and strengthen and improve their learning programs generally. And essentially what we want to try and do is to help you strike the right balance between managing learner needs, and they're ever growing, whilst working with budget restraints, and at the same time try and achieve the holy grail of sort of tangible, meaningful business outcomes for your organisations. That's the essential challenge that we live with every day. So essentially this report looks at things through driving learner engagement, the importance of making budgets work for us, and also evaluating impact and effectiveness. So that's effectively what the report's focused around. In terms of the general methodologies for the study, the target audience for the study was clearly around decision makers across organisations in Australia and New Zealand, and really targeting those organisations who are responsible for L&D budget and strategy overall. So essentially we conducted an online survey, and it was really designed to really extract vital information from decision makers and learners alike. And essentially what we did was the survey went out to the entire Skillsoft Asia Pacific client database, so it includes some existing customers in that. And as I mentioned, it was really designed to target learners as well as key decision makers from various organisations. In terms of what the report captured, from an APAC regional survey perspective, we actually gathered 490 responses, which represented 12 markets across Asia Pacific. And in terms of this particular report, Skillsoft gathered responses from 250 individuals, and that represented 150 organisations covering 20 industry sectors. And it's also worth pointing out that in terms of the data that we gathered, organisations from education and training services, IT and technical services, government, as well as banking, finance and insurance actually comprised the majority, 57% of the data collected, so just worth a note on that. So what I'm going to step you through now is just take a look at the findings. Hopefully some of these will be a validation of what you already know, which is great and still serves a purpose, and some of it, as we hope, will provide you with some key takeaways, what to consider in the programs that you have in place, what's working well, what to perhaps redesign, what to reconsider. So let's take a quick snapshot look at what organisations are doing. So these kind of highlight the key findings, and you all have a report so you can all read through it, and there's actually much more contained in the report, but these are kind of the high level views. What we have found is that for most of the organisations surveyed in Australia and New Zealand, in fact 84% are offering blended learning, and that won't surprise many of you in the room, I'm sure, who have been delivering learning solutions for a long time. But what is interesting about that is that organisations are increasing their shift from replacing traditional, more conventional modes of learning, classroom-led training pieces, to more e-learning and leveraging more of e-learning to really try and drive improved cost effectiveness of their programs and scalability as well. So that's the emerging trend, and that's what we're seeing more and more of. What is interesting of what the report revealed is that currently across the surveyed organisations, 41% of companies are offering mobile learning, so learning via a mobile device. What is interesting of the organisations who are currently not serving their learners via mobile solutions, 51% cite IT or technical security reasons as why they're currently not. It's clear also in the report that organisations would like to be providing mobile options to their students, and really for good reason, because the report also turned out that 74% of learners are actually wanting to access learning content via a mobile device. So that's kind of interesting. At the moment we're seeing a little bit of a disconnect there in terms of how organisations are responding to the whole rise and trend around mobile and what learners themselves are demanding. So an interesting point, and I wonder whether that's common in your organisations as well. The other kind of more just, I guess, fact piece that came out of the survey in terms of the spend. So what we're finding is a majority of surveyed organisations are spending around an average of $900 per learner, with 27% of organisations actually spending as much as, or whether it's as much as, I don't know, perhaps that's fairly modest, but $1,500 per learner. So that's kind of the statistics and where that lies at the moment. What's also interesting is most organisations do conduct some form of measurement and evaluation against their learning programs, really as a way of extracting reliable feedback from learners. That's particularly pleasing for us to hear. We actually, when we analyse our own data, we definitely notice a correlation between those organisations who have a measurement strategy in place and the correlation of a successful program compared to organisations who don't have a measurement strategy in place. So that's also interesting. It was interesting to identify what the top 3 common areas for most common metrics were that were applied in terms of measuring program effectiveness, and they were the 3 you see here on the screen in terms of order of frequency. So the bulk of organisations are leveraging improved performance by employee as a vehicle of measuring effectiveness of their program. 53% are looking at employee satisfaction, and then 49% are looking at improved performance by organisation. So what's particularly interesting is that although the metrics themselves vary from organisation to organisation, the real opportunity lies in the organisation's ability to be able to look at the data, consider the measurement, and apply that insight to help shape the thinking and inform the strategy. We're not always noticing that organisations are doing that as effectively as they might, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So we'll turn our attention to have a look at what the report revealed in terms of what some of the leading organisational challenges were that you're all facing out there, and I wonder how well this will resonate to what's going on inside your own organisation. But the first, and possibly not surprisingly, and as Glenn alluded to before, it's the whole issue of budget and resource constraints. I don't think there'd be a person in the room who feels that they've got an abundance of either of these things going on. So what was interesting, I shared with you a moment ago in terms of what the average spend is per learner across Australia and New Zealand. What I can say is that comparatively it is slightly higher to what our Asia Pacific neighbours experience. So just to put some context there, around 58% of organisations across the Asia Pacific market actually spend slightly less than us. They spend around $800 per learner there. But no doubt budgets and constraints in terms of resources and manpower are still emerging as the #1 issue. So cited by 20% of surveyed organisations as the number one challenge that they face. And what's further alarming is that the pie has shrunk or stayed the same for 64% of organisations surveyed. So budgets aren't increasing overall. And in fact, of that 64%, 33% of organisations surveyed actually noticed a decline in their budgets over the last 2 years, which is reasonably alarming as well. A further, all right, click forward here. A further, I guess, organisational challenge, if you can call it that, that was identified in the study was in and around the topic of investing in technology itself. So investing in technology has certainly been identified as critical when you want to deliver a more cost-effective program, and as the organisations are trying to strive to achieve, greater learning impact and getting more value from the available resources and budget that's available. So certainly investment in technology is an interesting one because there was some good news and bad news about this. So we were pleased to discover that actually 90% of organisations surveyed are offering some form of technology-assisted learning or e-learning. But what was interesting of that 94% who do offer e-learning, only 47% actually say that it's still a fairly modest ratio in terms of the percentage of the program that's actually covered via e-learning. So to the tune of only between 1 and 20% of the overall program. What was also interesting, of the 94% of organisations that offer e-learning, only 47% actively encourage their learners to participate in e-learning, which leaves a bit of a question mark as to why that may be the case. So potentially there's a huge opportunity to get further leverage from this resource and from this modality. So the other interesting piece was around, we alluded to this earlier, about the whole measurement and tracking phenomenon. So whilst we're happy to report that the majority of organisations surveyed do have some ability, some tool, some metric for measuring learner effectiveness, it's still fairly modest. So 64% of organisations have some sort of trigger in place. But what was interesting and somewhat alarming is that only 25% of learners felt that the organisation made adjustments in light of that insight. So potentially a huge opportunity there to kind of align more to the findings of the measurement strategy and the measurement tools that you are bringing to light in your programs. So let's turn our attention now to have a look at the first area of focus for the report, which was all around learner engagement. So this is all around what are learners saying they need. So here were some key takeaways from the whole learner engagement piece. The number one is around understanding how diverse your learners' needs really are. So there's no doubt, and the survey revealed it quite strongly, is that learner needs are evolving, both in terms of their needs and their preferences. So certainly learners have an increasing appetite to want to access learning anytime, anywhere. And while that's not particularly new, as we referred to earlier with regard to mobile learning, you've got 74% of learners saying we want to access it via a mobile device, but you're really only having 41% of organisations accurately and accommodating that piece. So again, something of a disconnect in terms of learner demand versus what organisations are catering to. What I found interesting in the report, and again on the subject of diversity, is this interesting little fact that for organisations who provide e-learning as an offer, as a resource to their population, of those organisations, 40% of learners felt that their organisation was adequately supplying the range of topics that they needed to perform their job. What was interesting, though, in reverse of that, was for organisations who aren't providing e-learning, only 25% of learners felt that their needs were being addressed in terms of the range of topics in order to perform their jobs. So that's a 24% differential in favour of organisations who are providing e-learning in terms of the range of topics that are being covered to address that area of diversity of need. So something to perhaps consider. The second area for driving learner engagement was all around, and I don't think this one's particularly obvious or new to you, but how well you are providing a program that is flexible and interactive. So whilst these things aren't new, it's perhaps just a reminder to have a look at some of the basics. You know, are you providing the flexibility to students that you ought to help optimise the benefit of your program and maximise your budget constraints that are in existence? So it's an obvious one, and we are pleased. It's heartening to see that 84% of organisations are offering blended learning, and for the most part for this reason. The final takeaway in terms of learner engagement is that learners really value the learning opportunities that organisations provide to them. However, 54% report that they feel constant pressure to make time available for learning and development. We all understand that. Everyone in the room will understand the problems with time pressure. So for organisations, the challenge around driving learner engagement is, what are you doing to ease that pressure? How are you catering to flexibility? How are you catering to making learning more consumable in shorter bite-sized chunks? And are you leveraging the natural benefits of technology to accommodate time-starved schedules? So that's the other thing to perhaps bear in mind in terms of driving learner engagement. So we'll turn our attention to the second focus area for the study, and we talked before about the phenomenon that 64% of organisations are actually either the budget is shrinking for them, or at the very best staying the same. So how do you stretch your dollars further, and particularly in light of the diversity of learning needs that we've just discussed? So here were some of the key takeaways in terms of what you can do to help deliver meaningful impact across your organisation, how you serve the diversity of needs, and yet doing that with minimal resources and shrinking budgets. So herein lies the challenge, but there are things you can do, absolutely, that you can do. So you can absolutely, in a time of limited and reducing budgets, you can actually expand your learning programs and drive cost effectiveness by switching up the mix a little. You can actually change, why are we only putting e-learning to between 1 to 20% of the overall program? Why wouldn't you switch those proportions and that mix and actually, scale up your investments with e-learning to give you greater reach, greater scale, and in so doing, reduce the average cost per learner? So it's a great technique for being able to service, the mantra of, doing more with less, which we find most organisations are trying to accomplish. So it's a really important thing that you can do. It's small, but it's about looking at what's the mix at the moment, and is that as optimal as it could be? Could you stretch your dollars further if you just tweaked the mix? So that's an important one. And keep in mind, as we've just discussed, e-learning absolutely lends itself to supplying a greater range and diversity of topics to your learners, as reported by learners. So something to factor in perhaps in terms of how to make those dollars spread a little further. Question the mix, call it out, do the right things, of course, as it's appropriate for the learning outcomes, but consider what's your default position, and should you change up the mix and allow those dollars to spread further. And don't forget, if you can change the mix, you're driving learner engagement and you're getting a greater variety of program reach. So something to consider. So we'll look at the final area of focus, and perhaps the most important, which is all around measurement, evaluating the effectiveness of your programs and considering how you're doing that. We've just talked about learner needs increasing, yet budgets are shrinking. So how do you make sure you're measuring, and more particularly, what are you doing with that information that you are measuring? So here are the two golden key takeaways that you need to factor in your overall measurement strategy. Consider this, that measurement must be purposeful. Only measure that you intend to do something with. Don't just measure for the sake of it. If you don't plan on doing anything with the information, why are you measuring it? So be very purposeful and specific about your measurement. The other thing, and as I mentioned earlier, there is definitely a correlation across, the 200 or so customers that we service in this region, those that have a measurement strategy in place or an evaluation strategy in place, absolutely outperform those organisations that do not. So you'll have a more successful program, you'll have higher learner engagement, as we talked about, and you'll be delivering a far more meaningful program to your learners if you do those things. This is the other thing I found fascinating about this particular report when you look at the detail of it. Feedback from learners really is important, and in fact there's a little statistic that I'll share with you in the report that for those organisations who take the trouble to get learner feedback, learners within those organisations are 71% more likely to say that the organisation is serving their needs for the skills and knowledge that they need to perform their jobs. The reverse is true though, that for organisations who don't seek feedback from learners, only 55% of learners say that the organisation is actually addressing the skills and knowledge that they need to perform their job. So the message is, seek learner feedback. There's a 16% differential in terms of learners who feel that their programs are adequately servicing their needs. So they're the key points, and what I will say is, as we've kind of covered off a lot across those three areas around driving learner engagement and managing budgets and dealing with effectiveness measures, what I would ask you is this is the question you need to take away today is, how are your current strategies dealing with learner engagement? Are you consciously thinking about learner engagement, and what strategies could you employ to improve learner engagement? How are you making budgets work right now? How does your current plan support the fact that there are shrinking budgets? And how does your plan today support not only your ability to get feedback from learners and evaluate the successfulness of the program, but what are you then doing with it? That's the important thing. So that's what I'd ask you today, and for the rest you can ask us because it's question time.